Bernstein. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. So I specialize in working with children and youth who have had trauma exposure. I also am the project director of what Michelle mentioned before, which is the ACTS project, which stands for Advancing California's Trauma-Informed Systems. And so we partner with different child welfare, behavioral health, and other child serving systems across the state of California to support some organizational change around being trauma informed. So, just a little bit about me. I'm originally from New York. I was in Oklahoma for a long time before making my way further west. And I've been here in San Diego at Rady Children's Health at the Chadwick Center for Children and Families for the last 8 years now. Um, so, for today, for this presentation, really it's for folks looking to learn more about child trauma itself, like what it is, as well as the impact that it has on kids, along with some practical strategies that we can all use when engaging and working with kids and families who have experienced trauma. I will be using the chat to talk with you all. Right now, I'm just looking at myself. So please, if you're able to put thoughts and questions in the chat, and I'm happy to try and answer those. All right, so for our time together today, again, my hope is to go over what child trauma is, to talk a little bit about what trauma looks like and what those responses to trauma looks like in children and adolescents, and then to focus on how can we respond to those. Okay, so starting off in the chat, if you will, when you hear the word trauma, when you don't screen it, just what comes to mind? When you hear trauma, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Okay, perfect. So we've got sad, pain, hurt, absolutely a lot of pain, abuse and neglect, harm, a stressful event, overwhelmed, overloaded, fantastic sadness, fear, overlooked, death, absolutely grief, ACEs. You guys can keep going. Amazing. And I bet if we kept this going, there would be lots more and more and more different kind of responses and answers. How I like to start off in that way is because there's a real uniqueness to trauma. Trauma is really unique to every individual that experiences it. So I think this is really important to keep in mind throughout the presentation, right? There's all these different thoughts and feelings that come up for folks when they hear trauma. And that experience is going to be unique to the person that experiences it as well. So, I'm a therapist, and when I see kiddos in my practice, I can see two siblings who have gone through the same exact trauma from the same exact home and have completely different responses to that event, right? And so, if we think about this definition of trauma, it's witnessing or experiencing an event that poses a real or perceived threat. So, I just really want to harp on the idea of perception. It's really, again, we know a lot of things about trauma, and I'm going to go over them today with you all, but it really is a unique experience for each individual. And it's their perception of the event that happened that is important to understand. The second part of the definition of trauma is that it's an event that overwhelms one's ability to cope. So I think there's been kind of a little bit of a cultural shift in the last decade or so where the word trauma has become more popular in our lexicon. I think we hear it more often. I think a while back, we really only heard the word trauma related to war. And so we hear this word often. I like to joke a little here that like I had a flight that was delayed. I got home super late. My computer took a long time to turn on. I had this talk this morning, but that's not trauma. That's drama, right? We all have a lot of drama and stress in our lives. But when we're talking about child trauma, we're talking about an event that overwhelms one's ability to cope. Often, kiddos and youth who experience a trauma think that they're going to die, right? So it's this really overwhelming event. It overwhelms our ability to think, to react. It changes the way we think about ourselves and the world. And it's really that perception of that event that's important. All right. So, different types of trauma. I'm interested and curious. What kinds of trauma might you see in the work that you do for those that do work with kiddos and families that have been exposed to trauma? What kind of folks are you seeing? So, neglect, abuse, domestic violence, abandonment, absolutely. Migration, abuse, divorce, drug use, neglect, emotional abuse, grief and loss, historical trauma. We'll talk a little bit about that. Amazing. Absolutely. Okay. So we're all on the same page here. We're all talking about the same thing. There's different types of traumas. You guys mentioned most of them. I'm not going to go too much into this. I think we all know what we're talking about here. Um, and I really, really love the examples of that you guys are giving. Spot on. So we just like to categorize those into kind of two groups. So we've got like those natural ones and then the human-made ones, which are really the ones that I'm seeing a lot of here in terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, neglect, things like that. Great. I just wanted to throw this up here. I'm not going to talk too much about this slide, but this is just a child-friendly way to talk about traumatic events with kids. So I often talk about them as scary or difficult things that happen to lots of kids. Um, a grown-up hit or hurt kids rather than domestic violence, or someone broke private part rules rather than talking about sexual abuse right off the bat. So just this slide is kind of for your reference. Again, just kind of like a child-friendly way to talk about some of these events that you all are mentioning. All right, so let's talk briefly about the different categories of trauma, starting with acute trauma. So, an acute trauma is like a single traumatic event that is really limited in time. So, think like a car accident, right? A car accident, hopefully, is a not a repeating event, is a one-time event. Um, these are not often the kids that show up in our spaces. More often than not, the kids that end up showing up in the spaces that we work in are chronic and complex and historical trauma. So, chronic trauma refers to the experience of a traumatic event that occurs over a period of time. And so it happens multiple times, which we know unfortunately is pretty common with things like domestic violence, right? When it comes to our door, it's rarely the first time that that's happened. So, this child has experienced repeated domestic violence, um, physical abuse, sexual abuse, right? We know that these things can happen over and over again. So that chronic trauma can be the same trauma happening over and over again, or it can be the experience that a child has experienced multiple different types of trauma. So they're living in a home where they witnessed domestic violence. They were also physically abused and they had to be removed from their home and separated from their family. And so there's a multitude of traumatic events. Those are typically, the kiddos that we see in our spaces. The next type I just want to mention is complex trauma. So complex trauma is very similar to chronic trauma. It's essentially chronic trauma with just this added criteria that this is when the traumatic event is perpetrated by a caregiver or an individual close to that child. So there's this kind of relational component with complex trauma, right? That social contract that we all have is broken, right? The people that are supposed to love you and take care of you and keep you safe did not. And so that has an impact on the way that those post-traumatic stress symptoms might show up in our spaces. Um, Again, I think it's helpful to separate trauma into these types, just again, because those with chronic or complex trauma tend to have more of a significant trauma response. It really does seem to have a profound aspect on a lot of different areas of development and functioning. So helpful for us to understand the kiddo and family in front of us. And then lastly, in no order here, um, is historical trauma. So historical trauma, and I saw some of you guys mention this in the chat, which is great. Historical trauma is this idea of intergenerational trauma, often experienced by a specific cultural group that has a history of being oppressed systematically. So it's really this like collective wounding that a group of folks can have. And not only affects like when we're talking about the other types of trauma, it affects the individual, but with historical trauma, it can continue to affect subsequent generations as well. Just curious in the chat if folks, as I'm talking about this concept of historical trauma, if anything is coming up for folks, if anyone wants to share an example of what might be historical trauma. Slavery, absolutely. Um, that I think is one that comes to mind. Racism, absolutely marginalization of certain communities, genocides. Great. Yeah, you guys are on track here with what we're talking about. Um, great. Okay, so learning a little bit just about the bare bones here, just of the basics of child trauma. Let's do a little poll here about which form of child trauma is most prevalent. So if we could launch that poll. So thinking about the prevalence of trauma, if we're thinking about, let's just say physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, which type of trauma do you all think happens most often or is the most prevalent? All right. I can see the participation coming in. I'll stop when we're at like, oh, maybe 80%. We're at 72. Okay, you seem to be slowing down. Okay, well, I'll end the poll here. I'll share those results. So, as you can see here, about 85% of folks on this webinar today said neglect is the most prevalent form of child abuse. So I'm going to stop sharing that poll, and you all are correct. So this information comes from Child Maltreatment Report, which is a collection of data from states across the nation that voluntarily provide their data on child abuse and neglect. And we see around 75% of children suffered neglect. So that's pretty high, right? In contrast, about 18% experience physical abuse and about 9% experience sexual abuse. And when I say neglect, just to define that a little bit more, we're talking about the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs. So things like lack of supervision, lack of protection, unmet basic needs. And I think I'd like to include this poll here because I think sometimes unintentionally we can tend to focus on what is most visible or what's most loud. And neglect is quieter, but it is deeply damaging and shows up as post-traumatic stress in similar ways to those other abuses that we mentioned. So just kind of a plug here, important for us as a field to really assess for aspects of neglect to better understand the kiddos that we're serving. Okay. Second poll and last poll, I promise, of our time together. This, dare I say, is maybe my favorite slide to go over. So if you could launch that poll here. So after a traumatic event, what percent of youth go on to develop post-traumatic stress? Variety of answers, loving it. It's really going back and forth here. It's very exciting to watch. Give it a little more time. We're at 67%. I'd love to get to 75 again if possible. All right. Seems to be slowing down. Okay. All right, we're at 73. I'll take it. Um, all right. So as you can see here, about a little over half of folks on this webinar said that around 80% of folks, 80% of kids after a traumatic event go on to develop post-traumatic stress. About 30% said 55% of kids, and then 17% and 20%. So I'm really excited to announce that the answer is C. It's 20%. So after a traumatic event, around 20% of youth go on to develop post-traumatic stress, which I think is surprising for a lot of folks, right? I think I'm definitely in this group as well. When I started working in the field, I heard, okay, I'm seeing a kid who's been sexually abused, PTSD. But in fact, and what is, I think, such a beautiful thing to know is that the majority of kids who experience a traumatic event do not go on to develop post-traumatic stress. there was an article, I think I put the citation here. The most recent data that I could find was from 2024, and it was a systematic review of the literature, and they put together this amazing meta-analysis on this topic. Um, and the percentages was anywhere from 12 to 20%, depending on if you're using DSM-4, DSM-5. We're not going to get into too much detail there. But the main point is, I see that Veronica put that in the chat, is shows the high resilience of children. Children are so resilient. And I think, when we're steeped in the trauma field, when we're day in, day out seeing children who've experienced trauma, it can kind of warp us a little bit to forget this fact that the majority of kids are resilient. So I'm really happy to share that statistic with you all. And I think it's helpful for us as practitioners and folks working in this field of trauma to keep that in mind when kiddos and families come through our doors, to not just assume that if a traumatic event happened, there's automatically traumatic stress and they automatically need trauma therapy. That's not the case. So that's why assessment is so important. All right. So, knowing that statistic, let's talk a little bit about who goes on to develop traumatic stress. So, I'll focus on sources of resilience and then risk factors as well. So, starting with sources of resilience, I'm just going to briefly mention temperament. Folks probably have heard that word before. Essentially, temperament is just a child's emotional and behavioral style of responding to the world around them. It's thought of as like a style kids have from birth. Some kids just have a unique way of responding to the world around them and to trauma. That's kind of all we really know about that. So I think what is a little bit more interesting, or what I get excited about, is the research about resilience. The one that I'm going to highlight, because the field has gotten quite wide in the last decade, I would say, is this idea of ordinary magic from Anne Maston. And essentially, this concept of ordinary magic is that it's ordinary, everyday factors that support this idea of resilience rather than these extraordinary traits that we can't label, which I think is good news. The three that seem to come up the most, well, I'll say the one that seems to come up the most in the literature as a huge source of resilience, and as we'll see soon, as a risk factor as well, is maybe not surprisingly a caring, safe adult. So, having a caring, safe, supportive adult after a trauma is a huge source of resilience for kiddos. That doesn't necessarily have to be their caregiver. It could be another adult in their life that's close to them. We also see from the literature that social and emotional support, again, maybe it's a big brother, big sister, it's a teacher, it's a peer, it's a friend, whatever it is, but that social and emotional support is really critical, as well as having access to resources. So, again, access to mental health resources, things like that are really, really important after a trauma, in terms of a source of resilience to not going on to develop post-traumatic stress. On the flip side, when we think of the risk factors, many of these are probably not too surprising for folks. Again, we've got temperament here, but I'm just going to highlight the last three. So again, the response of a caregiver, I think not surprising, that is super important. How they believe that individual, how they treat them after that trauma occurs, is going to be really critical. And I think that's why when we're doing trauma work, we should really be always thinking about working with not just the kiddo exposed to trauma, but that caregiver as well. Perception of danger. So we talked earlier about how trauma is very unique, and it's really all about perception. It's about that youth, that adolescence, that child's perception of the danger that they experienced. And then lastly, the relationship to the offender. So again, we talked earlier about that chronic and complex trauma. So that complex trauma has greater risks for developing more symptoms of post-traumatic stress that span over um, different areas of development. Again, this is when oftentimes it's that trauma is inflicted by someone that that child knows. Okay, I can't see anybody, so hopefully this is making sense so far. If it's not, please feel free to ask any question in the Q&A, and I'll hopefully have some time to answer that in the end. Or if you'd like to add something in the chat, I'll try and get to it as well. Okay, so that was our quick run through of an introduction to this concept of child trauma. I want to spend the next kind of chunk of time talking about what does it look like? What's going to come through my office or my space that I work in? How can I make sense of the responses that I'm seeing in the kids and families that I'm working with? So, warning, the next two pictures are might have a little bit of a reaction to them, so just a little bit of a warning. Okay, in the chat, if you could, when you see this photo, what comes to mind for you? Just first thought that comes to mind, you're on a walk, you're walking past this dog, what comes to mind? Eek, fear, scared, scary, aggressive, danger, reactivity, fear. Got it. Maybe the dog's protecting their owner, attack. Lots of fear, spooky, absolutely. Okay, great. I'm gonna go to the next slide. I won't keep on the slide for too long. Okay, now when you see this slide, what thoughts come to mind? Again, just throw them in, don't screen them. Sad, ouch, pain, poor dog, pain, helpless, a lot of sad, a lot of sorrow, a lot of poor baby, and a lot of pain, right? Yeah. I'm going to keep talking about this, but I'm going to move that slide so we don't all have to look at that. I show those two slides because what I think it, it is related to sometimes how we can look at the kids that have experienced trauma. Often what we see is that first slide. For kids who've experienced traumatic events, that pain is often invisible. And so all we see is that bark. And as you guys saw, when all that we see is that bark, fear, scared, aggressive, danger, right? When we can start to understand that invisible pain that's there, the experience and the pain that child has been through, just like what that dog has been through, we shift. We are, oh my gosh, empathy is so quickly to be able to access, right? And so I do think it's our role as trauma professionals or those learning and trying to understand about trauma and its impacts to really keep in mind what is this invisible story that's there so I can help empathize with maybe that bark that's showing up. And so I think that's encapsulated in this very, I think, popular phrase that's gone on around in the field. So you might have heard this before. But in essence, what we're trying to shift to when we're working with kids and families is not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. What has happened that is causing these big reactions, that are causing these things that are getting you in trouble, that are causing these things that are making a lot of tension in your family? Can we understand that? Can we understand those behaviors from a trauma-informed lens? And so that's what we'll spend the next 20 minutes doing together. Okay, so as maybe you can tell, I really do like to present this information about trauma in a very like kid-friendly way. So I'm going to continue to do that as I talk about the impact of that trauma has on one's mind and body. So trauma impacts the brain as well as our nervous system and our body. I'm not a neuropsychologist, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do think it's important to understand the impact trauma has on the brain. And the field has really exploded in this area again over the last probably decade and a half. But I'm going to just share with you how I talk about trauma's impact on the brain the way I would to a caregiver and the way I would to a kiddo, because I think it's just helpful that way. Some of you might already know this activity. It's called the hand brain or flipping your lid. There's a lot of different terms going around. So I included this slide so you can see that here. The way that I talk about how trauma impacts a child and adolescent's brain in a very simplistic way is I just use my hand as a brain. This is our brain stem, right? So this is the base of the brain, the first thing that was developed, the thing that takes care of those basic needs, those automatic needs like breathing. This is our thinking cap or our prefrontal cortex over here, right? This is a part of the brain that helps us think, helps us plan, helps us create a response to things. And then inside is our little feelings part of our brain, our amygdala, our cerebellum, right? So that's like in here. And what happens with trauma often is that we can experience a dysregulated nervous system. We can experience that fight, flight, freeze. And then our feeling part of our brain gets really, really, really big and it pops off our thinking cap. And we're really no longer able to make good decisions. We're really no longer able to um, use that prefrontal cortex. We're not able to make a clear plan. We're not able to use skills or tools. We're really just operating from that base brain, that like old brain, old part of our brain that was first developed. And so what we have to do in our work is try and help kids to put their thinking cap back on. How do we calm our feelings and calm our emotions so that we can put our thinking cap back on? All of that is to share that for kiddos who've experienced and are experiencing post-traumatic stress, around that like 12 to 20% of kids, a lot of time they're flipping their lid. And it's really hard to think and make plans and use skills. And so again, just a kind of a helpful way to kind of understand what's happening for these kiddos. Okay. I also want to talk about how trauma impacts the body. And I think, again, these two pieces can help us understand what we're seeing when we're seeing a child's or adolescent's response to traumatic event. So I mentioned earlier, we probably have all at this point heard of fight, flight, freeze, pretty kind of popular lingo. And so I think this is like an overarching way to talk about how kids respond to trauma. Again, I'm going to do the kid-friendly version because I just think it's very helpful. And again, these graphics are very simple as well. But my hope is that these can be like practical for you to understand, but also practical for you to explain to caregivers because all of this is psychoeducation. All of this is important information to help normalize and validate what that family is going through. So, um, I talk about this with families as our body has an alarm system, kind of like a smoke alarm in the house. And the alarm system that we all have, its job is to keep us safe. And when there's real danger, it goes off super loudly so that our body can be ready to run, to hide, to get help, whatever it is. It's amazing, right? Amazing that are developed in this great way. After something really scary happens, sometimes the alarm gets a little mixed up. It's super jumpy. It ends up going off when there's no danger, right? And that really is what that fight, flight, freeze is. My alarm is saying danger, danger, because it's been so on for so long because it had to be when I was in difficult or scary situations that now when I'm not in difficult or scary situations, it's still going off. My nervous system is still in the state of toxic stress. My stress hormones are still really high. Even though the traumatic event is no longer there, my nervous system is primed and ready to let me know about danger. And so when I'm bumped in the hallway, I'm ready to fight because my nervous system is ready to protect me, right? And so that's just kind of one way to kind of think about, again, why are our kiddos responding in this way? Okay, so there are ways that alarm, that kind of, I call it like a stuck alarm system, kind of shows up for kids. These are the classic. These are the categories of post-traumatic stress. And I'm going to talk about how they show up in our day-to-day as well. So because of that stuck alarm system, that can show up as hypervigilance. So being on edge, that fight, flight, freeze, my nervous system is in a state of continued stress. Those stress hormones are continuing to kind of guide me. And so I'm hypervigilant. I'm always on the alert for danger because, again, I need it to be. I'm gonna experience avoidance, so I'm not gonna want to think about the difficult or scary thing that happened. I'm gonna have some negative mood, and I might be re-experiencing the thoughts or image of the scary thing that popped up. So let's talk about what that can look like in everyday life. So in the reports that you read, in the things that the teachers share, in the things that kind of show up in our offices. So the first is that hyper arousal, right? That what we just went over, broken alarm system. When, again, a kid has been through a traumatic event, they are coming back to a home where their parent maybe is an alcoholic and they don't know, is today going to be the day that I get hurt? What's going to happen? They're walking on eggshells. Am I gonna see my mom and my dad fight physically? There's all of this unknown, and so their nervous systems are ready and primed. While that trauma is no longer happening, that nervous system is still on that high alert. And so what does that look like? It looks like kids being nervous and anxious. It looks like kids maybe fighting and being ready to fight. Again, if our nervous system is that on high alert, it's going to look like not getting enough sleep, difficulty sleeping, being on edge. If we are so over dysregulated, it's going to be hard to pay attention in class and pay attention in school. Now, again, as I say these things, these are not um, solely trauma reactions, but oftentimes we can see these in kiddos and think of other things that might be going on. And so we really want to keep in mind when we're seeing all of these symptoms, might there be something there? What does avoidance look like practically? Um, it can look like a kid being spacey and disengaged. So a teacher might say, this kid was really involved, and now all of a sudden they're just kind of sitting there. They never raise their hand anymore. Um, right? They're less interested in activities they used to enjoy. Maybe they're not participating in sports or not going over to friends' houses, or, they used to watch a movie and when they got home from school and now they're not. And it's rejecting comfort. They used to really love my hugs. They used to love being close to others. And I'm really noticing that they're kind of more solitary. Again, trauma is unique to each kiddo, but these are the common behaviors and patterns that we see after a traumatic event. With re-experiencing, so again, this kiddo is having these images and thoughts pop up in their mind when they don't want to. We're going to have sleep issues, right? Nightmares, things like that. If I'm thinking about the time my mom hit my dad, I'm going to have a difficult time paying attention in math class, right? Maybe a difficult time taking in new information. And so we're just starting to depathologize some of these behaviors and normalize them when we put our trauma-informed hat on. How can we see these behaviors from a trauma-informed way? Knowing what trauma does to the brain and body, knowing these symptoms, we can better understand the behaviors that we're seeing. So, just as an example, this is actually a colleagues of mine's example, but this is kind of what we call the worry brain activity. So, we ask this kiddo to put in what are they thinking about in their brain. You see things like playing, you see things like tests, but then you also see mom and dad, a knife, mom, and hitting dad. And when asked how many times they think about that, 1,000,000 times a day, right? So again, that re-experiencing that, we can imagine if that is happening for these kiddos, again, it's pretty invisible. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to pay attention. I'm going to have problems with sleep. Like, I'm going to be on more alert. My mood's not going to be great, right? How can we make sense that these kids aren't broken or damaged, that these are just responses to trauma? Um, so negative mood, we might see things like being distrustful, having a distorted image of oneself, a negative view of the world, and trouble forming healthy relationships. And the way I like to kind of, again, ground that back to trauma, now that we're all going to be trauma informed here, how can we make sense of what we're seeing? And how can I help this kiddo make sense of what they're seeing so they don't think they're a bad kid? How can I make this family make sense of what they're seeing so they don't think their kid's broken or damaged? Um, these are the common beliefs that we see impacted by trauma. Again, everyone's experience is unique, but there are some common reactions that we can be on the lookout for. So, two, three, there's these 5 categories. The first one is trust. So, we know trust after a trauma. This concept of trust can be impacted. And again, I don't think these are too far a stretch for us to understand. Maybe trust of oneself. Hey, I make bad decisions. I went to that party. I drank a little too much. Like, I can't trust myself. Um, Again, these are unhelpful beliefs that kiddos and adolescents can have. Mistrust of others. People hurt you. This is what I've learned. This is what I believe. Um, this sense of control. So there's a huge kind of challenge here with this idea of control. When I didn't have control, look what happened. I was hurt. And so it's really important for me to find control wherever I can so that I don't get hurt again. Or this belief that life's just unpredictable. Um, and again, I have to try and grab control where I can. Impacts one's self-esteem. Oftentimes, some of the core beliefs that we hear from kiddos that are experiencing post-traumatic stress is I'm a bad kid, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless, right? Um, People are bad, people hurt you, difficulty with intimacy. I shouldn't get close to people because they hurt you. And of course, uh, difficulty with the sense of safety, this feeling of being unsafe, this feeling that something bad will happen. And this is, as we're talking, I see in the comments, like, oh God, like this feels very sad. I, the reason I think it's helpful to go over together and to understand is I do think this is some helpful psychoeducation or just not psychobabble, we're just education for kids and for families. When I'm working with kids and families who've experienced trauma, it's helpful to say, hey, a lot of kids go when experience a difficult or scary thing, and when they experience this difficult or scary thing, they felt like they couldn't trust anyone. Wow, I feel that way too. It just helps folks feel like they're not alone in this, that these are, dare I say, kind of normal reactions to something really difficult and scary that happened to you. And so, how can we bring these out into the light? How can we talk about them? How can we normalize it for folks? How can we validate our kids and families who are experiencing this so we can help them move through this? Okay. So, all of that to say, to the part that I like the most, the part that I think is the most important, is that during a trauma, the brain and the body adapted to help this kid cope, which I think is pretty unbelievable. And so we can look at the behaviors that we're seeing as adaptations. These are adaptations to something that shouldn't have happened to this kid. And so if they're adaptations, we can look at them as in that way rather than a sign of damage. What we're seeing are probably learned behaviors. These kids had to learn how to protect themselves. They had to learn how to figure out what was safe, what was not. They had to learn how to grab control where they could. They had to learn not to trust others, right? And so if these are learned behaviors, then we can unlearn them. This is just a teen or a youth using coping, safety, and survival skills that they learn to keep themselves safe, backfiring now that we're in a safe environment. And so, again, I really, really like to have this mindset when we're working with kids and families for ourselves to understand, to empathize, to connect, to depathologize some of the things that we're seeing, and to support caregivers and kids in having this view as well. One last thing I just want to say here again is this can be kind of like an educational piece, really helps us to understand kind of where the behaviors are coming from. So the next section that we're going to get into is how can we respond? But I recognize that this is a ton of information that I'm sharing like really quickly. So I just want to pause here, see if anyone has any questions that you in the chat, just kind of doing a check-in to make sure we're all still here and this is also resonating for folks. Okay, great. Again, if you have questions that come up, please feel free to ask, and I'm happy to discuss. Okay, so so let's talk about, again, responding to child trauma. So how can we, learning all this information that we have about the behaviors, about the thoughts and the feelings that come up for kids and caregivers, how can we respond to this? So let's talk about some practical applications, things like predictability. So ways that we can be predictable in the roles that we have. There's a lot of different folks on this call. I'm sure it represents a lot of different roles. Um, in the chat, if you could, think about how might I create a sense of predictability for the kids and families that I serve? What is kind of, again, these are small, simple pieces that we can add into our work to help us be more trauma informed. So one of those things are routines. Absolutely. So having a routine, so maybe that can look like, okay, every time I see this kiddo, we're going to start our session the same way. We're going to start our work the same way. We're going to do this thing for 5 minutes, then we're going to go into this other thing, and then we're going to end with this. So absolutely, having some sort of routine. Helping caregivers set up routine for kids is incredibly important. So especially after a trauma, when that sense of safety is down, routines and predictability can provide that sense of safety. So creating a certain routine and sticking to that. What I see that can happen, and what I think the literature shows as well after a trauma, is that caregivers can respond by disrupting the routine. My kid just went through something so difficult and scary. I'm just gonna let them do whatever they want, right? They they deserve to just forget the rules. What we know is that that can actually be harmful. And what can be helpful, again, and safety is that predictability of routine, of structure. So, really important one. Consistency. Yeah, absolutely. Consistency in whatever the thing is that you're providing. I think that's key for all of us. Consistency does equate to safety. Schedule regular visits. So again, any sort of regularity that you can have. I know all our roles don't afford us that. I know the systems don't always afford us that. But being as regular as you can is important. Being on time, again, kind of a thing we all hope for, but really when we're talking about trauma, that consistency of timing can really, again, send that message of safety. These are really great examples. Having outlining objectives and goals. Absolutely. Again, maybe it doesn't initially sound like, oh, that's safety, but it absolutely can. Knowing what to expect, knowing what I'm expecting of you, it can be really helpful. That can also be really helpful for this concept of self-efficacy. So this idea that after a trauma, often kids have those distorted or unhelpful core beliefs that I'm not good at things, I'm a bad kid. And so giving them opportunities to achieve goals, is super, super important. So setting small, achievable goals that these kids can feel good about and start to build up that self-esteem back can be really important. Schedule. So absolutely, I see when I'm working with caregivers, creating a schedule, having a consistent schedule, whether that be if you're working with children and families like outside in your offices, creating a schedule for how the day's going to go, but helping caregivers create those schedules as well. Okay, these are really great examples. Choice. So I love that we moved on to choice. Absolutely. So, choice is another huge one. I mentioned that theme of control is often lost after a traumatic experience. So, how can I try and give that youth, that child, a sense of control back? One of the greatest ways we can do that is offering choice. So, these can be small choices. Just going to scroll down here. Again, in the chat, if you could, just so we can all continue to learn from one another, what are some ways that you can give kids choice in the work that you do? Again, small ways that you can provide some choice. Order of events, right? So sometimes you just got to do things with with these kids, and so it's, hey, we got to get these two things done. We've got A over here and B over here. Which one do you want to do first? Do you want to do A first or B first? Where they sit, I love that one. Um, I gotta ask you some questions today. Your answers are gonna be super helpful for me. Would you like to sit over here, over here? Sometimes kids love to sit in the big chair, love to sit behind the desk. What time you would like to meet, if that's flexible for you and you can do that, offering that choice is really important. What do we want to do for our free time? We have these options here. Do you want to play or do you want to read a book? So absolutely kind of right on with these ideas of choice. Giving our kids a snack or downtime before we go into study time. So absolutely, that's going to be routine. That's predictable. I know what to look for. I know what to expect. I'm going to keep that consistency. That's going to help me feel safe. So these again are small things that are really super important after a traumatic event. All right, some other ones that can be really helpful. um, are things like, not surprisingly, hope. And what I mean by this is how can we normalize and validate what our kiddos are putting forth and what our caregivers are bringing to us? So some of the material that I went over earlier is that educational material that can help normalize the experience that they're going through. I think the thing I hear the most from the kids that I work with um, are, wow, other kids experience that too. I thought I was the only one. Other families are going through this too. I thought it was just my family. That is really, really powerful. And when we share that, hey, actually, a lot of kids and families experience the same thing that you're going through, can help normalize that event and help normalize that experience for them. Um, Validation can come in the form of that education as well. So letting families and kids know that they're not damaged, they're not broken. These are common reactions to trauma. Doesn't mean they're easy to manage, doesn't mean it's not sad, but it makes sense why this is happening, right? That this isn't some um, kind of damaged response that's going to lead this child into juvenile justice. But these are common reactions that make sense after a trauma. And the last part is safety. How can we create a sense of safety in the environments that we have? Again, some of this isn't under our control. Some of these things we don't have control over, like the lighting in our spaces or the sounds that are going to happen. But to the best of our ability, how can we? So the story that I like to share here is I was working with a kiddo who experienced a trauma, who had experienced physical abuse and witnessing domestic violence. And loud noises were really, really difficult for this kiddo to handle. And so we were practicing um, experiencing those loud noises in session. And the kiddo would just bang on the table. I would bang on the table really loudly. And what happened is, not sharing that information with others, the person who was working in the office next door came out and started yelling, "What are you doing? What's happening here? What is all this loud noise?" And looking back, I completely understand. But when we are creating these opportunities, how can we create the environment to be as safe as possible? Letting others know what we're doing, trying to control that environment as much as we can, knowing that there are things out of our control, but there are also a few things that we do have in control, and trying to make that environment as safe and predictable as possible. Katie mentioned managing our own reactions, which I'm actually going to get to on the next slide. Okay, so this is a topic I think is important, as Katie mentioned, for ourselves. I think I also find it useful for going over this with caregivers. So this comes from Monica Fitzgerald's work called Let's Connect. So if you are interested in learning more about Let's Connect, I just put the um, title here on the bottom. This is one tiny, tiny piece of a much kind of larger intervention, but I'm pulling it because I think it's helpful to remind ourselves when doing this work and to remind our caregivers. As we talked about trauma responses, we've got these two types. I think we can kind of categorize them in these two types. We have these big reactions, right? This hypervigilance, this on edge, this ready to fight, lack of sleep, maybe aggression, these big behaviors. And that can really cause a reaction in us. Just naturally, it can, right? And so it's really, really important for us to manage our own reactions, and to help caregivers manage their reactions. The first step, I truly believe, is educating ourselves so that we can have that mindset, that lens of empathy and understanding. And then the second piece is really, okay, now how can I control my nervous system when somebody else's nervous system is dysregulated? So this is really just a simple pause and reflection. How can I pause? Maybe I know that I am about to supervise this visit or transport these kiddos or read this report or meet with this parent, and I'm expecting that there's going to be a lot of emotions, or maybe if I'm working with the kids, maybe some big behaviors. How can I kind of prepare myself? Again, this is just kind of a simple pause and reflection. So the pause is what am I feeling? Asking ourselves what we're feeling and naming the feeling that we have. There's a lot of neuroscience on the impact of naming our feelings and the benefit that that has in reducing our stress hormones. So, what am I feeling? And then what do I need? And just asking ourselves this periodically. Putting our hand on our heart can be really helpful. What am I feeling and what do I need? We can use that for ourselves, but we can also use that as a way to support caregivers in dealing with the maybe some of those disruptive behaviors. So I mentioned that there's kind of two categories of behaviors that we can see in kiddos. One, as I mentioned, is those big behaviors, those enlarged behaviors. And then the other one that we see, category that we see is kind of that under, not under regulated, but those kind of shrinking away behaviors. So um, things that can look like depression, getting smaller, avoiding folks, avoiding relationships, disengaging from activities, disengaging from relationships. Again, that can be dysregulating for caregivers as well. That can be really frustrating. It can be frustrating for us too as professionals when we have a lot that we want to get done with this kiddo, but we're really, really seeing that kind of avoidance as we do with post-traumatic stress. So all the things that we just talked about. Okay, we're going to start with this fun activity here. Then I'm going to give you a choice of what we want to do next. Then we're going to take a pause and we're going to do this other fun thing here. And then I'm going to ask you two questions, right? That specific scheduling, routine, regulation can really, really be helpful for kids and families who've experienced trauma. All right. One other piece here that I'd like to go over is we talked earlier about this concept of fight, flight, or freeze. When a youth is in fight or flight, that is when, if you remember, the thinking cap is flipped up, right? So if we think of going back to that hand brain, after when we are experiencing post-traumatic stress, when we are experiencing that fight or flight, we are operating from our feelings state. And truly, our prefrontal cortex that helps us with our thinking and our planning and our ability to say, oh, what would be helpful here if I like take some deep breaths is offline. And so I think it's really important to understand what that looks like so we can respond in an appropriate way. So in the chat, if you could add what does that look like for you? Or what have you seen it look like for kids when they're in that fight flight mode? What kind of behaviors? What are some clues that tell us that a kid might be in that fight flight mode? Defiant. So they're just being super defiant. That can be swearing. Okay, there's a lot here. So we're very ready and primed for this. I'm just going to go through a few of them here. Um, Nervous, avoidance, a blank stare. Um, and absolutely, I agree with you. I think some of that might be freeze. So when we are in freeze mode, we are like almost, it's like we're dissociating, right? So when we're in freeze mode, we are, which can be similar to fight flight in terms of how we want to react, but that freeze mode really is that um, um, blank stare, that kind of numbed look, that avoidance, that kind of shrinking back, that shutting down. Fight or flight, I'm seeing some things like being really frustrated, having aggression, your face gets flushed, right? Physiologically, our nervous system is getting ready to fight or run. And so that blood is pumping, our heart is racing, and we're kind of dysregulated in that way. Oftentimes, these behaviors, when we're in fight or flight, can look like they go from 0 to 100. So the caregiver will be like, all of a sudden, for out of no reason, there's this huge blow up, right? Because all of the things that you mentioned in the chat, those are things that don't have to be related to trauma. That can be related to a lot of other things. Sometimes it's really hard to know when a kid is in fight or flight or freeze. And it's not a one-to-one, but there are some clues. So I think seeing those like physiological signs can be a clue. Knowing that, hey, it's kind of gone from 0 to 100. Oftentimes, what might have happened is that kid has been triggered. A lot of the triggers can be really hard to identify. Sometimes kids don't even know their own triggers. So we'll see that like big explosion of behavior. We see often when it's fight or flight, all the things that you mentioned. Um, Nervous, crying, angry, aggressive, all of the yelling, throwing things, tense, shaking, all of the behaviors that you all mentioned. Again, we'll see 0 to 100. We might also see that after those behaviors happen, the child feels kind of like embarrassed or remorseful. Oftentimes, again, when it's fight or flight, it's not really in that kiddo's control. Again, their thinking cap's off and they're just in fight or flight. And so when they come down from that experience, it can feel kind of out of control for that kiddo. Again, this is really hard to map one-to-one, but just want to give us some clues around, I wonder if the reactions, the behaviors that I'm hearing, that I'm seeing, that I'm learning about are trauma behaviors. So after a child might feel remorseful, they might, come over and apologize or feel kind of embarrassed about that. And so, what can we do? What can we do when a child's thinking cap is off, when they are in that state of fight, flight, freeze? The first thing we can do is to create this sense of safety. This can be for us working with kids and teens. It can also be something that we work with caregivers around. So, standing a few feet away from the child, speaking in a calm or quiet voice. This is not the time to talk. It's not the time to say, remember your safety plan or remember this. When our thinking cap is off, it's really a time for quiet, calm, and safety. So, good activity that we might want to model is putting our hand on our heart and just breathing. Again, we don't want to use too much language here when a kid is in fight or flight. We just want to kind of model what's like maybe a good coping tool that they use. If I have a slide here, I'll go over some examples, but things like box breathing. So you might just want to do this, but really not a time for a lot of conversation. What we know is that that conversation can escalate that youth or that child, escalate that sense of fight or flight. What we're doing is trying to calm ourselves down. Um, in the chat, I see it's the same for adults. Absolutely. It is definitely the same for adults. I think most of the things we teach kids are the same for adults. We just teach it in a maybe a more simplistic way, but all of this is very helpful for ourselves as well. So, great point there. After we're hoping to create the sense of calm, maybe reflecting a good coping skill, maybe offering to do a coping skill together. If that child, if gauging your own, if we're really, thinking cap is fully popped off, then I don't think that's very useful. But in certain situations, it can be. And then just allowing this child to calm down, backing away, being quiet, using less language. We can still stay close if we're worried about danger. But let's say, you're in your space. I'm going to use one of the things Alexandria shared in the chat. So throwing things out, I'll save breaking things. So we want to respond to non-harmful behaviors in this way. If the behavior is harmful, like or destruction of property, then we're going to react in a different way. We can't just like let that kid keep breaking things or let that kid keep hurting themselves or others. So if it causes harm to a person or property, we're going to respond in an appropriate way. But if it is non-harmful, then I think this can be very, very useful. So it might look like, okay, they're throwing things. I'm going to step back. I'm going to step away. So I'm not in the line of fire here. I'm going to say, maybe I'll reflect. I can see we're super overwhelmed right now. I'm going to do some breathing and I'm just going to be right here. Over time, what we'll see is that will come down. And so these are just, again, a few helpful strategies we can use when we're noticing a child in fight or flight or when we're working with caregivers to support them. All right. I wanted to just provide a few resources here. So if folks have not heard, again, this was a very quick and dirty run through of trauma. There's a lot of different aspects to trauma. I think each section that I presented on could have been its own 3 hour training. So I hope that each section was just kind of a little bit of a taste and an introduction. If you would like to learn more and continue to learn about that, I recommend the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or the NCTSN. They have really wonderful um, resources and information, not just for helping professionals, but also for caregivers and kiddos. They have a lot of like downloadable, again, resources that one could use in whatever role that you have. Um, this is a CalTrin training, but I'm also going to highlight the CBC if you're interested in, okay, what are, if you're a therapist or if you want to refer to evidence-based practices for trauma, I would recommend looking at the CBC for what those evidence-based treatments are. As I was going through this presentation, and we're talking about the impact that trauma has on kids and families in the chat and in my own reaction and response, you hear a lot of, oh God, like this is sad. Like this is really sad to see. I think one of the beautiful pieces is that some of the best outcomes we have in mental health are for child trauma. So interventions like trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, we see about an 80% success rate in reducing PTSD before and after treatment. And so there is a lot of hope, I think, in this work, in understanding trauma, in getting kids connected to evidence-based treatments for trauma and providing those interventions for kids. Um, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Some other resources here. The Incredible Years and Defiant Teens and Defiant Children are, these can be classes that caregivers go to, but they can also be books. And it just helps understand some of that misbehavior that's coming up. It's not necessarily related to trauma, but oftentimes trauma and that disruptive behavior can really come hand in hand. And then the last one I'll just say here, although all these books are really great, Healing Days, I think is a beautiful book to just talk about what trauma is, talk about all the things that I spoke about today, but in even more of a child-friendly way. It also has a note to caregivers at the beginning to help caregivers understand about trauma. And it's a book that I like to read with kids as I start my work with them to just, again, help them normalize and validate what they're going through. Um, so I'm obviously the project director of the ACTS project, but I think our website has a lot of great resources on trauma and trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care is just taking all the knowledge that we learned today and that we're talking about today and thinking about how can I apply it to the way that I create my organization? How can I apply it to the way that I create my practices and policies in the work that I do? And then how can I apply it to the actual work that I do with kids and families and to myself so that we can take care of ourselves as well. So each of these items are clickable on the website and each has resources. Lastly, I like to end with this quote here and just touch on this topic of post-traumatic growth. This is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who said, "The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen." So again, while this presentation was quite heavy, I have had the privilege, probably the great privilege, one of the greatest privileges of my life, to walk through children and families who've experienced trauma and support them on this journey to the other side, where there is, for a lot of kids and families, this sense of what we call post-traumatic growth that can happen, really seeing the world in kind of a different way. And so there's a lot of hope and a lot of beauty that can come from really difficult things that we experience. And so, all the more reason to make sure that we are acknowledging and assessing for and understanding trauma and its impact so that we can get kids and families to the services and supports that they need so that they can live kind of this beautiful life that they can. Um, I wanted to just put this link here. I'm not gonna talk about this. I think this is a good place to end here. But if you'd like to see, this video really impacted me. If you remember, Elizabeth Smart was the individual who was kidnapped from her home and then experienced several different types of trauma, and then was able to escape. And she talks about her experience, and that while she wouldn't wish on anyone else, she also wouldn't change anything because of what it's taught her. And I just think that is just such an unbelievable perspective to have when we're in this field. And if you are on this call and you are working day in, day out with trauma, I think it's really important for us to remember this piece as well, along with the heaviness that comes from it. So with that, thank you so much. I'm gonna probably pass it over to Michelle. I think you were monitoring the question and answer portion. So if there are
Mhm.
any lingering ones there, I'm happy to answer them now. I know we've got about 15 minutes left, so I ended a little bit early.
Yeah, no worries. Oh, thank you, Dr. Bernstein, for this very insightful presentation. All I'm hearing is a lot of thank yous right now, and for all of this crucial information on the in the chat. And I don't see anything in the Q&A just yet, but that doesn't mean some things might not come in. We'll give it about a few more minutes just to see if anybody had any lingering questions. Really appreciate all of the gratitude in the chat right now.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you
Mhm.
guys for being here and being interested in child trauma at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. So
Yeah.
appreciate everyone. And I think with this work, it's really helpful to have a community of folks and to stay connected to community around this because this work can be really difficult and really heavy. And so doing things
Yeah.
like this can be really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bernstein. And if you could switch to the next slide, we can give folks information on how to get their survey, how to get their certificate and their CEU. So make sure that you check out the chat. We put in there the link to the survey, and that is how you access your certificate for attending today's trainings and eventually get your CEUs as well.